from the war in Ukraine to the US-Mexico border and beyond. We come to you from 3 different islands. One was once a part of a global empire that began with overseas trading posts and evolved into possessions, dominions, protectorates, mandates, colonies, and other territories ruled or administered from afar from the late 16th century and eventually made to decolonize after World War II. Another was once a Dutch colony annexed by the Qing dynasty of China in 1683, ceded to the Empire of Japan in 1895, grabbed up by the Republic of China in 1911, but which claimed independence as a sovereign nation following World War II, though the Chinese would say otherwise. And the third, originally annexed by the US in 1898 during the Spanish-American War due to its strategic position in the Pacific Ocean, then was made a formal territory before becoming the 50th US state in 1958. My guests are Executive Director of Witness Radio and member of the leadership team of Witness at the Border, mi hermano, Camilo Perez-Bustillo. Camilo is Chair Professor of Human Rights at National Taiwan University's College of Law. He is also a fellow at both the Institute for the Geography of Peace that straddles the border between Ciudad Juarez in Mexico and El Paso, Texas, and Norway's University of Bergen Global Research Program on Inequality. He is co-chair of the National Lawyers Guild's Task Force on the Americas and co-founder of the International Tribunal of Conscience of Peoples in Movement. He is also lead author of Human Rights, Hegemony, and Utopia in Latin America. Joining me and Camilo, actually let me drop his info in the chat, there you go. Joining me and Camilo is activist scholar, Dr. Nandita Sharma. She is professor of sociology at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Her research addresses human migration, migrant labor, nation-state power, ideologies of racism, sexism, and nationalism, processes of identification and self-understanding, and social movements for justice. Nandita is author of Home Economics, Nationalism and the Making of Migrant Workers in Canada, as well as Home Rule, National Sovereignty and the Separation of Natives and Migrants. And here is where you can find Nandita. Also joining us from the University of Hawaii at Manoa is Dr. Reece Jones. He is professor of geography and environment. He is the author of 4 books, Border Walls, Violent Borders, White Borders, and Nobody is Protected. He is Guggenheim Fellow and the editor-in-chief of the journal Geopolitics. And here's where you can find him. Finally, there's me. I'm Sarah Towle, a London-based author, historian, educator, and human rights defender, sharing my journey from outrage to activism in my forthcoming book, The First Solution, Tales of Humanity from the Borderlands. I'm also a member of the leadership team of Witness at the Border and the host and director of Witness Radio. And as co-author of The Rap Complaint, I sit on the advisory team of the Cameroonian Advocacy Network. And here, last but not least, is my information. Just before we begin, a few points of housekeeping. We're going to leave the chat open so y'all can talk amongst yourselves, because that's always fun. But if you have a question for any of our panelists, please drop it in the Q&A. And myself or my colleague, Carla Barber, who does all the tech on these webinars, will make sure that it gets the attention it deserves. So with that, let's begin. Now, I don't have to tell any of you, because you're already here, that we live in an age of unprecedented global movement. There are over 281 million international migrants in the world today. Some, like the 4 of us, are lucky to experience freedom of movement and to have migrated by choice. At least I'm making that assumption for the others, but it's certainly true of me. But the global population of people displaced by violence, persecution, conflict, human rights atrocities, or events that seriously disturb the public order, like natural disasters, related to climate change was higher than ever before at the end of 2020, according to the UN Refugee Agency. The number then was 82.4 million. That was up from 70.8 million in 2018, which was up from a little over 43 million a decade before that. So the trend is only going in one direction, and that was before the war in Ukraine. An associated trend is the building of barriers and fences and walls, as well as technological, infrastructure-based, and bureaucratic means to stop some people in their tracks or to deter them from coming at all. When the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, for example, there were 15 walls worldwide. As of 2018, that number had jumped to 77. It is more today. As our guests have spent their careers studying and documenting in their works, which I recommend to you without reservation, border walls have given rise to state-sponsored violences such as indefinite detention, forced disappearances, deaths at sea, desert deaths by dehydration, deportation in chains, most often back to harm, as the same barriers simultaneously embolden organized crime, creating markets that prey on the hopes and dreams of those seeking a better life. We see these phenomena on an upward trend as well, particularly at the borders of the world's richest nations, the US, Europe, and Australia, despite all their claims to believe in and respect human rights. And then there was the war in Ukraine. Since late February of this year, Russia's invasion of this sovereign nation has displaced internally an estimated 6.5 million people and caused another 4 million and counting to flee. Considered refugees, they have found welcome in neighboring countries, as it should be, including Poland, which as of March 26, 2022, had opened its doors to an estimated 2.2 million Ukrainians. That's the same country that left 3,000 to 4,000 Syrians, Afghans, and Iraqis fleeing similar perils, though labeled migrants, to freeze and starve to death in its border forests as the 27 member states of the European Union looked on. Meanwhile, in the last 2 years, a lower number, 1.7 million people, have been expelled by the US without any due process under US or international law due to the dubious use of a public health order called Title 42. That's vulnerable people flown back to the harms they fled or pushed into violent Mexican border towns and left to fend for themselves. In the past year, an estimated 1,600 souls were left to drown in the Mediterranean Sea. Over 2,000 Haitian refugees, that's fewer people than would fit in a Texas football stadium, were shackled, forced onto planes, and dropped back into a burning house. And less than 100 Cameroonian asylum seekers were sent back to the same harms Ukrainians have been forced to flee under egregious conditions in violation of myriad international human rights conventions. So I'd like to kick off our discussion today with each of you in turn, explaining to us how we got here. What are the historic dynamics at play in a world where some people forced to move, including children, are rejected, vilified, criminalized, and left to die, while others are welcomed with the dignity that all human beings deserve? Reece, perhaps you could start us off with a greater understanding of the concomitant development of maps and nations and the violence that results when the world is carved up and lines are drawn. Nandita, perhaps you might pick up where Reece leaves off to give us insights into how borders work to include or exclude, and how that dynamic is exploited by nations to justify and normalize violence against the other, even in a world where basic human rights have been codified and agreed upon by the same powers. And Camilo, I'd love for you to define for us what makes a migrant versus a refugee versus an asylum seeker, and how these labels are products of nation building and might be used or abused by them. So I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. That was a really great introduction. I feel like you could probably just keep talking the rest of the time. I mean, you did an excellent job of kind of laying out the current situation and the problems that we're facing at borders. You asked me to speak a little bit historically, and so I can definitely do that. I think we have the problem that we're often stuck in the lens of presentism, that we are born into a particular world, and the world that we're born into has the world political map. It has countries. It has this idea that those countries should have sovereignty over their territories, and that they should be able to restrict movement at those borders. And that has been the case since most of us were born. But if we take a longer historical view, the world looks nothing like that, right? This is a very unusual and unique period in the history of the world that really only our generation of people has lived in a world that's like that, right? And so what I try to do in my work, and I think Nandita, Camilo also do the same thing, is to try to think outside of that a little bit. And if we think back more historically, I mean, historically humans are migratory. We are a species that moves around the world. And that's what our ancestors have done for generation after generation after generation. For most of the history of humanity, we were hunter-gatherers, right? Who were moving over a range, were using resources in that environment. So the idea of restricting the movement of other people arises with the idea of the state, of an institution that has control over resources. And we could have a whole debate over the history of the state and the connections to agriculture and slavery and those sort of things. But there's a clear connection between the rise of these groups of people claiming exclusive control over resources, over wealth, over land, and then the need to use violence to restrict other people from accessing those same places and land and resources. So most early states, many early states, maybe is a better way to say it, were based on slavery. So they were using movement restrictions to extract wealth and value from other human beings and to profit off of that. What I've argued in some of my work in Violent Borders, for example, one of my previous books, was that the system that we see today is very similar to that, but the scale has changed. That we see a similar sort of system where the wealth of the few in privileged places are protected through movement restrictions and limiting the ability of the poor to access opportunities in other places. So in the past, that looked like slavery, that looked like poor laws, that looked like vagrancy laws. Today, that looks like borders, that looks like immigration laws, it looks like visas, it looks like walls, it looks like the Border Patrol, right? But the result is the same thing. The privileges accrued by a few in particular places are protected by restricting the movement of others. So maybe I'll pass it on to Nandita at this time to talk a little bit about nation and identity in that equation.
Excellent. Thank you. Nandita, you're muted.
Yep, there I go. Thank you very much, Reece and Sarah, for getting us going. I think that we need to make a distinction between the formal organization of our world, which today is a world of nation states, each with their own immigration and citizenship laws that restrict rights on the basis of what status the nation state bestows upon you. And I know that Camille will talk about this a little later. So to distinguish between the formal organization of our world and how people actually live, right? Like border controls, border walls, et cetera, haven't been able to actually stop movement. And I would argue, and others have argued, that they're not necessarily designed to prevent movement. They're designed to sort out those people who have rights within the places that they live and work and those people who don't have rights in the places that they live and work. So I think a really important starting point when we're talking about this world and this enormous disconnect from how it's actually lived and how it's formally organized by nation states is nationalism. Nationalism doesn't carry the same negative connotations that racism does. And I think that that is something that we need to change. We need to understand nationalism as dangerous, as serious, as life-destroying as racism. As, you know, nationalism is as powerful in organizing what happens to a person from birth to death, as is racism. And we need to take it very seriously, particularly because this new global apartheid that Reece talked about, right? That some people have are able to live in the rich world, other people are trapped in the poor world, is largely organized through our general universal acceptance that nationalism is something to be proud of, right? Nationalism is something to defend. Nationalism is both understandable and justifiable. So I think that if we look at how, much of the outrage that we've seen by comparing the treatment of people fleeing Ukraine from the treatment fleeing other places like Syria, like Haiti, like Central American nation states, the outrage that we've all experienced, which is perfectly justifiable. The problem of racism is today that kind of racism that we're outraged at is organized by regulations and restrictions on immigration and citizenship. So we need to understand and take on as a major political project how it comes to make sense to us that we live in a world of border controls, right? And so I think to start having that conversation, it's important to understand that the idea of nationality, right, as the basis for self-determination and as a legitimate ground for exclusion is an outcome of a long history of racism, right? The formation of national identities was formed historically through the desire to create racialized communities of belonging and exclusion, right? So nationality is presented as some kind of race neutral category, but of course it is far from that. And we can see this through how racism was absolutely central to the formation of each and every single nation and subsequently nation state in the world today, right? So I think that I'll just end it with the point that the idea that it's okay, in fact, it's desirable to live in a world composed of distinct and seemingly equivalent nationalities, right, is precisely what is allowing nation states to effect racist exclusions without naming it as racism, right? It's just, this is how the world is. We all have our nation. We should all stay in it. Nation states have every right to determine who gets into their territories. That is precisely what we need to challenge if we have any hope of actually ending the racism that we're seeing today.
Yeah, that's excellent. I want to come back to that. Remind me, because I remember reading about, how in your work about how politics, kind of exploit the in-group, those who were made to belong by the border, to help them justify the violence against the other and, keep the status quo in power. So let's come back to that. But Camilo, take it away. I think you're muted.
And what do I have to do here?
There you go.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. First, I want to stress how much I've learned from the work of Reece and Nandita. So for me, it's a privilege really to be able to exchange here. And the way I look at this too, and I mentioned this before we got started, is I see this as a beginning of a dialogue, as a way for us to work together from the perspective of what we're trying to do through this initiative called Witness at the Border, but also our efforts to try and globalize that initiative. So as we look at what's going on in Ukraine and in the EU, what we're trying to do is think about what it implies, what it says about the work still to be done at the US border and at Mexico's southern borders, and the ways in which the US's borders and the most regressive aspects of US immigration policy have been regionalized, have been extended beyond US territory, have been imposed on neighboring governments, where we have Mexico transformed supposedly into a third safe country, et cetera. And then the border essentially pushed further south into South America and the Caribbean. So anyways, for me, that's sort of why we're here, is looking at what's going on in Ukraine and asking ourselves, and this is where I'll kind of chime in a little bit as a lawyer. We're looking at the same global empires in their concrete expression through the EU, NATO, and the US that systematically exclude and deny rights at their border, now project themselves as supposedly those who embrace, those who need protection. And Ukraine has served very well for those purposes. But I think we have to understand what an empty propaganda exercise that is in the face of the realities that continue at the EU's borders, other than as to Ukrainians or those who have Ukrainian passports or pass other tests in terms of color and origin, and what continues to happen at the US border. So this idea that the EU and NATO are fighting for freedom and democracy in Ukraine is a sad joke from that perspective. And the same from the perspective of the US and its rhetoric of the defense of freedom and democracy. That, for us, I think, has to be the point of departure. When we speak from the perspective of peoples in movement, what we say is these categories of migrant, asylum seeker, refugee are in effect further constructions of what are machineries of exclusion at the heart, and the way in which those are spread. That's what we understand as Title 42, or what we understand as the, quote, migrant protection program, the so-called Remain in Mexico policy, and the way in which the US has felt free at the head of this global coalition, supposedly for freedom and democracy, to continue to shut its doors, to continue to send back Haitians and Cameroonians and others and Central Americans systematically. And all of the ways those policies are the fruit of the US's own construction of global empire, just as they are in the context of the EU. You know, the EU's relations with Morocco or with Libya or with Turkey, or what happens at Lampedusa, or what happens in the Aegean Sea, et cetera. All of the ways this system of global apartheid, of global racial empire, what Olufemi Taiwo has written about, how they're reproduced through these mechanisms. I mean, there are important legal and historical reasons why those categories exist of migrant, asylum seeker, refugee, et cetera, but they're all distorted by these mechanisms. And they're transformed themselves into forms of exclusion and into methods of exclusion. And so I think that's sort of the arbitrariness at the heart of this, I think, is what we have to continue to emphasize. I also want to respond quickly to something that's been posted, which is important, sort of commenting on Nandita's critique of nationalism. I think something we have to remember is that in the US and in Europe, the trend now is for those that we would normally categorize as anti-immigrant in terms of their thrust and the policies they promote, to defend themselves, saying that they're not being racist, they're simply being nationalist. You know, make America great again, et cetera. And, you know, that's what, you know, is a ground for convergence between Trump and Orban in Hungary and the current government in Poland, by the way, as Sarah reminded us. And that's what sort of is the basis of their legitimacy. What they're saying is, what they're defending is that nationalist impulse. And so nationalism is especially dangerous in that context. Parties like Vox in Spain, for example, the anti-immigrant movement in Italy, in Scandinavia. I mean, this is really a a continental pattern, but also a global pattern. And you know, it's Narendra Modi in India as well. I mean, so it takes all kinds of different forms. That is very different than the kind of nationalism that's being highlighted in the chat in terms of the struggle of the Kurdish people for self-determination or the Palestinian people, et cetera. And so it has a very different edge to it. I think the question is, how is nationalism being used? And obviously the ways in which it's constitutive of continuing forms of exclusion. So anyway, we'll come back to all of that, but.
Right, yeah, that actually gets to my comment to Nandita. And it also, I'm seeing you nod your head a lot, Reece, so I'd love to turn it back to you. I'm one thing that comes to mind is reading your white borders. You know, we can have the delusion that what is happening today is unique and new, and we can get outraged and fix it, but you lay out very, very carefully in White Borders that this vilifying of the other that we don't want to include, you know, really dates back to the founding of the nation. And the same language that Trump used when he came down the golden escalator at Trump Tower and started his campaign was the same language used by congressmen to get to ensure that no more Chinese were allowed into the country. So, you know, I'd love to just turn it back over to you and have you pick up where Camilo left off.
Sure. Yeah, this has been a great discussion so far. I have so many things to add to all of these comments, but to answer specifically what you were asking about, yeah, in White Borders, I try to start with the question, was Trump and his language something unique to our period, or is it something that's part of a much longer trend? And as you suggest, it definitely is part of a much longer trend. What I argue in that book is that in the US, there was not a strong effort to restrict immigration into the country until non-white immigrants started to arrive at the borders and want to be members of the community. So I think a lot of people are often surprised to learn that the US didn't have any national immigration laws until the 1870s. There were some state level immigration restrictions in places like Massachusetts and New York, but those were ruled unconstitutional in 1849 and again in 1875. So it wasn't until there was a large Chinese migration after the gold rush to California that the US started to put rules on who could enter the country. So the first of those is the Page Act of 1875, and followed by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which prevented that Chinese immigration or sought to. And what we see in the decades that follow that is as each new group of non-white immigrants start to arrive at the country's borders, new restrictions are put in place to limit those movements, while at the same time continuing to try to open up as much flow from Northern Europe and from the UK as possible. And so, yeah, when you look at the language of how people talked about immigration of Chinese immigration in the 1870s and 1880s, it's the same sort of metaphors that we see today. You hear about migrants bringing drugs. You hear about diseases coming with the Chinese. You hear about them taking jobs, but also being lazy and influencing white Americans not to work in the same sort of ways, right? But one word particularly that connects those different eras is language of invasion. In the 1870s, the idea was that the Chinese immigrants weren't here just to work and be part of the United States. Instead, they were an invasion force. They were going to transform the country into something that it wasn't before that. So yeah, so there are absolutely these connections throughout that period where immigration restrictions are fundamentally about racial exclusion, about limiting who can come into the country in order to construct an idea of who belongs in the nation.
What's interesting to me about the Chinese Exclusion Act is they didn't even try to hide their racism, right? Like migrant protection protocols, we all know didn't protect anyone, but Chinese Exclusion Act says exactly what it did, 100%. Nandita, there's a question from one of our audience members, Catherine Potigil. I hope I pronounced your name right. is asking, if we resist the concept of nationalism, what happens to the concept of sovereignty?
Well, if we are successful in challenging the tremendous hold that nationalism has on our imagination, and therefore legitimizing a great deal of violence in the world, I would also like to see the end of sovereignty, right? I think one of the sad, even tragic aspects of our history over the past 100 or so years is the belief that sovereignty is the basis for our liberation, right? That sovereignty is the basis for our protection. And that's really buying into, a centuries old European treatise that we all enter into a compact or a contract with states willingly, voluntarily, in order to avoid a life of violence, because supposedly the state will protect us. And we can see, speaking of Ukraine, national sovereignty in Ukraine has not protected people in Ukraine from war, right? From death and destruction. Sovereignty is not the basis of our power and protection. Our power and protection lies in our collective refusal to be governed, right? Our collective refusal to allow people to take our land, to exploit our labor, to put themselves in a position of authority over us, right? So this is very much an anarchist perspective, of course, but going back to an earlier point that Reece made, that was a great point, is that all states, as long as there have been states, have tried to control people's mobility, right? Reece talked about the early states that tried to control people's mobility out of state territory. Yes. Nation states today generally don't really care about controlling people's exit from their territories. They're very much concerned about controlling entry into their territories. And so you cannot have national sovereignty in the world today, right, or ever. You cannot have national sovereignty without immigration controls, because immigration controls is the mechanism by which to control who has rights within the territories that they're living and working, right? Mm-hmm. And the last point that I'd like to make, because I know that people get very concerned about what this means for people who are currently fighting for, quote unquote, their national sovereignty, like people in Palestine, like Kurds, like Hawaiians, so on and so forth. And what I would caution us when we're supporting those kinds of struggles is, life does not get better under national sovereignty. You only have to ask people in Honduras, people in India, right? People in Ukraine, what national sovereignty has accomplished for them. Did it protect them, right? Mm-hmm. No. So, I would also caution us against saying that there's some good nationalisms and that other nationalisms are bad nationalisms. So the nationalisms of the right are bad, the nationalisms of the left are good. I would caution against making that distinction, because support for nationalism is the basis for exclusion, right? Support for nationalism is the basis of some of the most profound inequalities in the world today. So mm-hmm. we can't escape that by saying that there are oppressed people fighting for nationalism. What we could do instead is to develop social movements that are much more capable of realizing freedom than our national sovereignty movements.
So you can't really untie nationalism or nation states from sovereignty.
I don't believe we can. We only have to look, my parents were born as British subjects in the British colony of India, right? Mm-hmm. My grandparents were activists against British imperialism. Mm-hmm. And, and look at India today. Mm-hmm. India fought a very courageous anti-colonial battle. And who won? Not the people in India. It was the people who rule India. It is the capitalists who are able to use the Indian state to rule. Look at what is happening inside India, where more and more people are being culled as members of the Indian nation. So if you're Muslim, if you're Christian, if you're Parsi, if you're poor, right, you're being cast out of the idea of the nation. So we really have to be very, very cautious about repeating history and saying somehow Palestinian sovereignty, Kurdish sovereignty, Hawaiian sovereignty is somehow going to be different than all of the sovereignties that currently exist.
Right, many of which have been corrupted from the moment that they were achieved in the course of the latter half of the 20th century. So, Camilo, shifting to you, are you seeing this this ongoing and increasing trend of mobility in the world, which all of you have identified as a global apartheid, as something that can be undone? Do you have any hope? Or I know you've been focused with your students on how the pandemic has exacerbated inequalities and really laid bare the problems endemic in a world turned into a global apartheid. Is it a Gordian knot that can be unraveled?
You know, I think there are two layers I'd want to emphasize, and I completely agree with Nandita's critique. I mean, the way she just laid it out. I think one thing that's forgotten in this discussion often, just, you know, more generally, is the differentiation between national sovereignty and popular sovereignty. And it's forgotten, in effect, that it's popular sovereignty, which is really what we're fighting for from the perspective of the groups that are excluded by whatever mechanisms we're highlighting. And when I talk about popular sovereignty, it's what's referred to legally as the concept of self-determination, but it's become conflated with this idea of creating national states, not about building structures of autonomy that in fact are pushing against the edge of those states and seeking to transform them. So one way, if we kind of zoom out to think about it, is one thing that we've tried to emphasize in terms of a more critical approach to human rights, for example, in terms of decolonizing human rights and breaking it free of this framework, is to emphasize that when we look at the world, the two most generally excluded groups from that supposedly rules-based international system, from that system of international human rights that's so widely promoted these days and propagandized, are precisely peoples in movement and indigenous peoples. When we talk about peoples in movement, it's trying to bring together from a more integral perspective those groups that are normally classified or divided into migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, but also those forcibly displaced. And so what we say cuts across that is the framework of forced migration on the one hand, and understanding that framework in that context, but also the insistence on the demand by migrant movements throughout the world for the recognition of the right to freedom of movement. But that right to freedom of movement also includes the right not to move, the right to stay home, which means the exercise of our popular sovereignty and autonomy independently of existing states and against them where necessary to exercise our ultimate rights, not to depend on states, not to depend on nations as the vehicle. The other thing is, so what we're talking about then is, on the one hand, peoples in movement, on the other hand, indigenous peoples as the ones who are promoting this critique in their movements, in their intervention in the world, and seeking to restructure existing states in terms of collective, transnational subjects of rights. And that's where we need to go. From an international system premised on nation states, which is the current international system, which has done nothing to protect the Ukrainian people or the Palestinians or the Kurds, or name the group. I mean, just pick your example. But on the other hand, which moves towards an international system based on the rights of peoples and popular sovereignty. And so I think that's the direction in which we need to go.
Which is also what we were talking about with our friend in Colombia, the doctor Martin Rosen, what was his name?
Manuel, absolutely.
Manuel, right. And he spoke about autonomies. And I'm just going to shift back to Nandita real quick, sure. Because you talk about the commons as the development of the commons as a solution out of this mess. And I wonder where those concepts of local autonomies as self-governing and tied to the land connect with this idea of the commons. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, thank you. I think that, one of the things that we need to start with in that conversation is to distinguish between land and territory, right? Land is the basis of life, land, air, water, right? Our planet is the basis of all life. Many times when people are talking about land, they really mean territory, right? I'm actually very troubled by the term peoples, right? I think the idea of peoples is actually the foundational term for the idea of nations, right? The idea that there are distinct, discrete, isolated people that have sovereignty, have their place in the world. That is actually the world that we live in today, right? We live in a world where people imagine themselves as distinct people of a nation. So I don't think that we just get away from the dangers and the violence of nationalisms by calling it something else, right? Calling it popular sovereignty or calling it people's struggles, right? But I do think that the commons does not talk about territory, right? It talks about land. The commons also, the kind of commons that I'm working towards is a planetary commons, because one of the things that is, there's a major disconnect in the world today is the scale at which our lives are organized and the scale of our imagination of ourselves, right? We imagine ourselves as somehow these, whatever term you want to use, local, people in these places, whereas each and every one of us on this planet is so deeply connected with everyone else and all life on it, that to talk about a commons in just one place and then other people can form their own commons elsewhere, I think is not, would reproduce many of the problems that we have today and would not correspond to the way that people actually live their lives today. So this planetary commons has not existed before, right? There, of course, before there were states, there would have been commons across the world, but there wasn't a kind of collective imagination that we are together in a planetary commons. So the key distinction about the commons from every other political community, every other system of access to land and air and water is that the foundational principle of the commons is the right, and that, I understand that rights-based language is problematic, but I'll just use it for now. The right to not be excluded is the basis of the commons today. Is the basis of the commons, period. So can we form social movements that emanate from that principle, the right to not be excluded, right? Some of the most powerful movements that I am really inspired by are people in movements who are refusing the state inscribed categories that they have been identified with, right? Particularly refusing the distinction between migrant and citizen. Right. And we see incredible efforts in that regard at the US-Mexico border. We see it throughout Central America with the caravans, right? We see it in the Mediterranean, we see it in the Aegean, we see it in the Indian Ocean, we see it around the world, right?
Yeah.
Those are the movements that we could be amplifying. The bases, the political bases of those movements, the rejection of nationalism, the rejection of state, the desire for a planetary commons, those we could be amplifying because they also exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I would encourage us to do that. And if I could just say one more thing, I'm
Sure.
at that time, is that, you know, in addition to, you know, my discussion of how ending racism and this incredibly differential treatment of people that we see according to how they have been racialized in the world today, in order to, you know, I've talked about how we need to really challenge our nationalist ways of thinking, but I don't think, I think that today, nationalisms across the world, not just in Europe, not just in the rich world, not just in the United States or Australia or New Zealand, but across the world, in African nation states, in Asian nation states, in nation states in the Americas, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, many of them are actually centering their incredibly violent acts around precisely the category of indigeneity, right?
Mm.
If you look at the discourse that preceded the Rwandan genocide, right? It was a discourse that said the Hutus are the indigenous peoples of Rwanda, and they are being colonized, invaded, precisely the terms that Reece was using, you know, and have been in place since there's been nationalism, that the Tutsis were the invaders, were the migrant invaders. If you look at the genocide in Myanmar, it is precisely the discourse of indigeneity, right? That Burmese Buddhists, Buddhist monks, the Burmese military, the Burmese, you know, state, even under Aung San Suu Kyi, right?
Mm-hmm.
Explicitly saw Burmese Buddhists as the indigenous peoples of Myanmar, formerly Burma, and Rohingya people as, again, migrant invaders, right? So we really, I would caution us against like this kind of easy slide into indigeneity as the basis of all that is good in the world, because some of the most violent acts in the world today, Cameroon, South Africa, you know, Fiji, Uganda, you know, around the world is being done in the name of an indigenous people protecting themselves from an invading migrant horde, right? And so we really see and one last thing, we see this with the Cherokee in the United States. We see this with Mohawks in Canada, right? The idea that if you are not genealogically related to what some imagined prior Cherokee nation or Mohawk nation, that you can legitimately be expelled, you can be excluded, you can be cast out of that category. These, I'm arguing, are all part and parcel of a nationalist way of thinking. And indigeneity today, not all people who identify as indigenous are nationalists, but all indigenous nationalist movements are not going to produce different results than any other nationalist movement.
Wow, there's just so many places we can go, and we've got 10 minutes left. We should have done this for an hour and a half. This is, I don't know about you, but I'm really enjoying this conversation, but now I'm confused about where to go. There's a wonderful comment in the chat, Dora, speaking about the solidarity mobilized with regard to Ukrainian refugees does highlight this sense of the commons, where it wasn't with regard to Syrians in a similar situation. And Ken Barnes has a question that he's asked me to pitch to Nandita, but I think it's equally valuable to pass to Reece, because in your other book, Violent Borders, I think it is, you talk about the historical examples of this idea of the commons, as I understand it, as how, you know, the kind of the beginning of the carving up of the world and turning it into private property and usurping indigeneity. Ken asks, can you please explain how this idea of a commons in the future is related to the kind of commons which existed prior to the advent of private property. For example, before the enactment of the Enclosure Acts in England, which you write about. So I'd like to pass that to you, and then we'll try to shift to, you know, what can be done and where we can go from here to bring about a better world. So take it away, Reece.
Yeah, sure, definitely. Yeah, I mean, Nandita is so inspiring with what she was just saying. I almost want to let her keep going, but the thing I would say, if you think about what a lot of our global problems are right now, what are the problems that we can't solve? It's things like climate change, right? And the issue is that we have a global environment, but we're trying to solve that on a state-by-state basis, right? This idea that individual groups of people can make the decision for their land. And that's why we can't come up with a solution to solve this global problem, right? We saw that with the pandemic, right? The pandemic is going to spread all around the world, but each nation state decided what to do for their own group of people, right? And we essentially deal with the failings of the least successful of those, right? Which the US was one of the ones this time, right? And so there are places like in the Pacific, in the South Pacific, where some of those places have had their first cases of COVID in the last couple of weeks, right? Because they successfully avoided it for a very long period of time. But nevertheless, the failures elsewhere still gets back to them, right? So the same thing with the movement of people, right? We have a global economic system, we have a mobile species, but nevertheless, we give individual states, groups of people, nation, this right to control who can enter and move between territories, right? So in each of those instances, we have a global phenomenon that we're trying to solve the problems on a state-by-state basis, right? And it's going to continuously fail until we recognize the flaws of that particular formulation of power that we have in the world today. And instead, we start thinking towards a global commons like Nandita is talking about. And so I definitely share her view around that we need to think of these things in a global sense, because we live in a globalized world, but we, as of yet, don't have a global political system, and we don't have a global sense of morality, right? We often have a nationalist sense of morality. And maybe I can quickly transition that to talk about the Ukraine thing, because I think that's exposed that so clearly, right? I mean,
please. Perfect.
On the one hand, right? I mean, we've been hearing for years that the US and the EU can't possibly handle all of these refugees, migrants showing up at their borders, right? I mean, in the EU, there were 1.5 million people showed up in 2015, right? And it was this crisis, catastrophe that can no way possibly be handled. But somehow in a 1 month period, the EU has taken in 4 million people without any planning at all, right? So, exactly. So it definitely bears the lie of that, right? That was a lie always and still is a lie. Yes. That there is not a possibility to handle the movement of people. It's very possible to do it. It's about the desire to do it. But it's also showed the racism of it too. If I can just throw one last thing in there, that it really is about, as we've been talking about, that borders and immigration restrictions are about this exclusion of who belongs, right? It's where that identity is performed, right? And I think the racialization of who is allowed in and who is excluded has become so obvious with this issue. So whether that portends an improvement of this in the future, I'm not so sure, but it definitely has proved the point that those of us sitting here in this panel have been making for years about the roles that immigration restrictions play as a proxy for racism.
Yeah, I think this is a great way to zoom toward the end. We have 5 minutes left, and I did want to ask all of you to comment on, are you encouraged by what's happening in Europe with regard to the welcome with dignity of Ukrainian refugees? Is it something we can replicate and use to try to unravel the Gordian knot at the intersection of global capitalism and racialized border relations? Or do you fear that once the war is over, we're just going to go back to the status quo? And combined with that, if this is an encouraging moment, and I agree 100% that moving back toward a kind of global commons is really our only hope in a world fraught with diseases that know no borders and global warming. That seems like, can we undo the nation state and leave behind the so-called structures that are supposed to be supporting and protecting, like the UN, which is really all about keeping borders alive and well, right? It's kind of not really serving us as it's supposed to. Is this a moment? Is this a moment that we can harness and move positively toward the future in creating social change? Sorry, that question was way too long, but please, I'd love all of you to tackle that in the last few minutes we have.
Nandita, I would say.
Go ahead, Nandita, you want to start?
I think any moment is the moment to start.
Yes.
Improving.
Fair.
Right. So, yes, the hypocrisy that has been uncovered with the differential treatment of people fleeing Ukraine and the differential treatment of which people were fleeing Ukraine, right? Were they quote unquote
Exactly.
white Ukrainian nationals, or were they not white non-Ukrainian nationals, right? Like all of that needs to be, that hypocrisy has been highlighted. But I would at the same time say that the experience of seeking a safer place to live that people in Ukraine are going through right now is the bare minimum that every human being on this planet should be expecting, right? And that would be the really great basis for a revitalized, movement for the freedom to move, right? The freedom to move, I think, is the basis of a movement that is capable of leading us to a planetary commons. It is also not a new movement. It is the inheritor of the anti-slavery movement. It is the inheritor of the anti-enclosure movement, right? It is the inheritor of feminist movements. It is the inheritor of anti-colonial movements, right? The freedom to move has been an age-old struggle, and it is taking, the form that it's taking today because national immigration and citizenship controls are the basis of so much inequality and disparity in the world. But simply calling for the freedom of movement can get us to the commons.
Okay, great. There's a good takeaway. Camilo, you want to add?
Just the last thing, which is, I think the only encouraging thing about Ukraine is it creates a new floor for us, a minimum, which is whatever was done to welcome Ukrainians has to be done for everyone at every border, starting with the US border and with Mexico's southern border, if we think about it in a continental frame. And so that has to be the point of departure. The emphasis has to be on the critique of nationalism as we've heard it, of global capitalism, of course, as part of that, of global empire, but more than anything else, this affirmation of the right to freedom of movement as what we normally think of as immigrant rights. It's the right to freedom of movement globally and at every border. And until we have that, we don't even have the semblance of global justice or of planetary commons. That's how we get there.
Okay, great. Love it. We didn't even talk about the global capitalist empire, but I think we all know it's there. Reece, you want to finish us off?
I mean, I think they've both said it pretty well. So I will just reiterate what they said, that, that I think we are at an important moment. And I think that we're having a lot more conversations about the violence of borders and the right to move than we were having 5, 10, 15 years ago. And so I'm optimistic in that sense that it's something that is part of the conversation now. But I think I am pessimistic that in the short term that there's going to be any major changes in that area. But we need to keep pushing for it, right? That it really is, the freedom of movement is a fundamental right that we should all be pursuing. And a lot of other rights emerge from that.
Wonderful. This has been such a great discussion. The chat is just going crazy. You should all check it out. I'm so honored and so grateful to have been in discussion with you all tonight. Just to let our audience know that this is part one of a part two of a two-part discussion. We're going to shift the conversation, the same conversation, to Europe a month from now, on April 21st. And hear from people who've been on the border in Ukraine. And I hope Nandita and Reece, you'll come and be a part of it. And maybe we can do this again because we really didn't have enough time. Thank you so much. I encourage all of you to go out and buy their books and really dig into all that they've been talking about well before I became conscious of it. And hopefully we're going to turn this conversation into a podcast so it can live on. So thank you very, very much for coming. And thank you to the audience for coming as well. I'm very enthused, except that it's midnight here. I might not be able to get to sleep tonight. So enjoy your days. And I hope to be in touch with you very soon.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nandita, Reece, Sarah. Un abrazo. Thank you.